Imagine a world where your thoughts aren't truly your own. Picture waking up every morning, scrolling through your phone, watching the news, chatting with friends, all while invisible forces shape what you believe, what you fear, and what you desire. A world where reality itself seems to shift, depending on which information sources you trust. Now ask yourself, how would you even know if this was happening to you? What if the greatest threat to your freedom isn't physical chains or locked doors, but carefully crafted messages designed to imprison your mind? This invisible control system has a name: propaganda, and its power to enslave us is exactly what George Orwell warned about decades ago. Today, we're going to explore how propaganda techniques that Orwell feared have evolved into sophisticated tools of manipulation that can quietly rob us of our autonomy. We'll journey through the warning signs Orwell left us, examine how modern propaganda operates in our digital world, and uncover the psychological tactics being used against us every day. Most importantly, we'll discover how to break free from this mental slavery and reclaim our ability to think for ourselves. By the end of this video, you'll gain an insight so powerful it could permanently change how you consume information and protect your mind from manipulation. You'll see the invisible chains that may be limiting your freedom and learn exactly how to break them. Let's begin our journey into understanding how propaganda enslaves minds and how we can liberate ourselves in a world determined to control what we think. George Orwell's novel, 1984, paints a terrifying picture of a society where propaganda doesn't just influence people, it completely reshapes reality. In Orwell's dystopia, the ruling party controls everything through constant surveillance, information manipulation, and language distortion. The Ministry of Truth rewrites history daily, erasing inconvenient facts and fabricating new ones. Citizens don't just accept these contradictions, they're conditioned to embrace them through doublethink, the ability to hold two contradictory beliefs simultaneously. When Winston Smith, the protagonist, writes, "Freedom is slavery" in his diary, he's repeating one of the party's core slogans. This deliberate contradiction serves a purpose. It breaks down people's ability to think logically. As Orwell wrote, "The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command." This warning wasn't just creative fiction. Orwell had witnessed propaganda's power firsthand during the Spanish Civil War, where he saw how both fascist and communist forces manipulated information. His novel Animal Farm reflected how revolutionary ideals could be corrupted through propaganda, with the pigs gradually rewriting their own commandments until "all animals are equal" becomes "all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others." Think about how these warnings relate to our world today. How often have you seen facts twisted to fit competing narratives? How many times have you watched the same event described in completely contradictory ways depending on the information source? Historically, propaganda has been a powerful tool for control. During World War II, Nazi Germany's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, perfected techniques of mass manipulation, famously saying, "If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it." The Soviet Union maintained elaborate propaganda systems that rewrote history books and airbrushed disgraced officials from photographs, a real-world version of Orwell's memory holes. But propaganda didn't disappear with these regimes. It evolved. Modern research in psychology helps us understand why propaganda works so effectively. Our brains use mental shortcuts called heuristics to process the overwhelming amount of information we encounter daily. These shortcuts make us vulnerable to manipulation. Dr. Robert Cialdini, in his groundbreaking work on influence, identified key principles exploited by propagandists. Authority: we trust experts and officials. Social proof: we follow what others do. And consistency: we try to align with our previous statements and beliefs. These natural tendencies helped our ancestors survive, but in today's information environment, they can be weaponized against us. Consider confirmation bias, our tendency to accept information that confirms what we already believe while rejecting contradictory evidence. A 2016 study from the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology found that people are more likely to accept negative stories about politicians they oppose without fact-checking, while scrutinizing similar stories about politicians they support. This selective acceptance creates the perfect conditions for propaganda to flourish. Another powerful factor is emotional reasoning. When content triggers strong emotions, especially fear, anger, or outrage, our critical thinking abilities diminish. Neuroscience research using fMRI scans shows that emotional arousal activates the amygdala while reducing activity in the prefrontal cortex responsible for logical reasoning. In simple terms, when we're emotional, we're easier to manipulate. The digital revolution has created entirely new ways for propaganda to reach us. We're no longer just passive consumers of newspapers or television. We're active participants in spreading information through our social networks. A 2018 MIT study published in Science found that false news travels 6 times faster than truth on Twitter, spreading further and reaching more people. Why? Because falsehoods trigger stronger emotional reactions, particularly surprise and disgust. Think about your own experience. Have you ever shared a shocking headline without reading the full article? Have you felt that surge of validation when information confirms your existing beliefs? These aren't coincidences. They're exploitable psychological patterns. As we continue, we'll explore how these vulnerabilities are being systematically exploited in our modern information ecosystem. The tools of propaganda have evolved far beyond what Orwell imagined, becoming more personalized, more pervasive, and far harder to detect. But first, ask yourself, how much of what you believe comes from careful consideration of diverse evidence, and how much comes from repeated exposure to messages that feel comfortable and familiar? Your answer might reveal just how susceptible you are to modern propaganda's influence. Let's examine how propaganda has transformed in the digital age. Today's propagandists don't need centralized control of information like Orwell's Ministry of Truth. Instead, they exploit the very technologies designed to connect us. Social media platforms weren't built to inform us, they were built to engage us. Their algorithms are designed to maximize attention, not accuracy or balance. As tech ethicist Tristan Harris explains, these systems are trained to learn exactly what keeps you scrolling, what triggers your emotions, and what content you're most likely to interact with. This creates what researchers call filter bubbles, personalized information environments that reinforce our existing beliefs while hiding contradictory perspectives. A comprehensive 2020 study in Nature examined over 100,000 news stories shared on Twitter over a 10-year period and found that platform algorithms consistently amplified partisan content and emotionally charged misinformation. The more outrageous or divisive the content, the further it spread. This isn't an accident, it's the predictable result of optimization for engagement. Modern propaganda doesn't just spread falsehoods, it overwhelms us with information. The fire hose of falsehood technique, identified by Rand Corporation researchers, involves pushing out numerous contradictory messages across multiple channels. The goal isn't to convince you of one particular lie, but to exhaust your critical thinking and make you doubt that truth even exists. As one subject in a Stanford study on misinformation said, "If I don't know what to believe anymore, I'll just go with what feels right." This confusion serves powerful interests. When people can't agree on basic facts, meaningful collective action becomes impossible. The public sphere fractures into competing reality bubbles, each with its own truth. Orwell warned about exactly this when he wrote that the party's goal was to make the very concept of objective truth fade from the world. Computational propaganda represents another evolution. Research from the Oxford Internet Institute documented how automated bot networks amplify certain messages while suppressing others. During critical events like elections or public health crises, these bots can account for up to 45% of message traffic on some platforms, creating the illusion of widespread public opinion where none exists. Another modern technique is astroturfing, creating the appearance of grassroots support for ideas that actually serve powerful interests. A 2019 investigation by ProPublica uncovered dozens of seemingly independent local news sites that were actually controlled by political operatives and corporate interests. These sites mimicked legitimate journalism while selectively presenting information to promote specific agendas. Consider how propaganda manifests across different institutions. Government agencies craft carefully worded statements that technically contain facts but tell an incomplete story. Public relations firms create entire campaigns designed to shield corporations from accountability. Media conglomerates select which stories deserve attention and which voices deserve platforms. Each selection and framing choice shapes our perception of reality. The cost to society is immense. A 2021 Pew Research study found that Americans on opposite ends of the political spectrum now operate with entirely different sets of facts. This isn't just disagreement about interpretations. It's disagreement about what is real. When propaganda succeeds at this level, democracy itself becomes impossible. How can citizens make informed choices when they can't even agree on the problems that need solving? This fractured information landscape also creates perfect conditions for extremism. When people feel they can't trust traditional information sources, they become vulnerable to more radical voices offering simple explanations and someone to blame. Studies from the Network Contagion Research Institute show how propaganda techniques are increasingly used to radicalize individuals online through a gradual process of isolation and information control. Think about how these dynamics might be affecting your own understanding of the world. How many of your strongly held beliefs come from diverse, verified sources versus repeated exposure within your preferred information channels? The most effective prison is one where the prisoners don't know they're imprisoned, or worse, where they've been convinced the prison is actually freedom. As we move forward, we'll examine the deeper philosophical implications of living in a propaganda-saturated environment and explore practical ways to break free from its influence. But first, reflect on this. In Orwell's 1984, the ultimate act of rebellion wasn't violence. It was the protagonist's attempt to preserve his independent thought. In our world, that same rebellion starts with recognizing the forces trying to control how you think. Now let's explore the profound philosophical implications of living in a world saturated with propaganda and what it means for our freedom. Hannah Arendt, who studied totalitarian regimes, observed that propaganda doesn't just change what people think, it changes how they think. When bombarded with contradictory information and constantly shifting narratives, people eventually abandon the very idea of factual truth. As Arendt wrote, the ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, true and false, no longer exists. This insight connects directly to what philosopher Noam Chomsky called manufactured consent, the process by which powerful interests shape public opinion to support their goals. In his analysis with Edward Herman, Chomsky demonstrated how media systems filter information in ways that ultimately serve dominant political and economic powers, creating the illusion of free choice while actually constraining the options people can imagine. The philosophical concept of autonomy, your ability to make genuinely free choices, depends on having accurate information. If your understanding of reality is systematically distorted, how can your choices truly be your own? This is what makes propaganda a form of slavery. It chains your mind while leaving your body apparently free. The psychological impact is equally concerning. Research published in the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology found that exposure to contradictory political messaging increases anxiety, reduces trust in institutions, and leaves people feeling powerless. When we can't determine what's true, we experience what psychologists call epistemic learned helplessness. We give up trying to find the truth and instead rely on trusted authorities to tell us what to believe. This creates perfect conditions for psychological dependence. People crave certainty in an uncertain world, making them vulnerable to sources that offer simple explanations and someone to blame for complex problems. Studies in political psychology show that the more anxious people feel about their social status or economic security, the more susceptible they become to black and white thinking and authoritarian messaging. Consider how this might manifest in your own life. Have you ever felt overwhelmed by conflicting information to the point where you simply chose to trust a familiar source rather than work through the contradictions? Have you found yourself avoiding certain topics because the disagreements seem too fundamental to bridge? These are natural responses to information overload, but they also create openings for propaganda to take root. The parallels to Orwell's concept of doublethink are striking. In our world, people routinely hold contradictory beliefs without confronting the contradiction. They can believe in freedom of speech while supporting censorship of views they dislike. They can advocate for evidence-based policy while rejecting scientific consensus on issues important to their identity. This cognitive dissonance isn't a bug in the system. It's a feature of minds shaped by competing propaganda narratives. So how do we resist? History offers some guidance. During World War II, citizens in occupied countries developed counter-propaganda networks, sharing verified information through trusted personal connections. In the Soviet Union, samizdat, self-published literature, created alternative information channels outside official control. These historical examples share a common element: small communities of trust committed to maintaining standards of truth despite external pressure. Modern research on propaganda resistance points to similar solutions. A 2020 study in Science Advances found that teaching people specific techniques used by propagandists, like false equivalence, appeal to emotion, and straw man arguments, significantly improved their ability to identify manipulation attempts. This approach, called inoculation theory, works like a mental vaccine, exposing people to weakened forms of propaganda so they can recognize and resist the real thing. Media literacy education shows similar promise. Research from Stanford's Civic Online Reasoning curriculum demonstrated that teaching students to ask key questions: who created this content? What evidence supports it? What might be missing? Significantly improved their ability to evaluate information critically. These skills don't just protect against specific falsehoods. They build intellectual immunity against propaganda broadly. Perhaps most importantly, reclaiming your cognitive liberty requires conscious effort to diversify your information diet. Research from the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism found that people who intentionally consume news from sources across the political spectrum show greater resistance to partisan propaganda than those who stick to ideologically compatible sources. This doesn't mean treating all sources as equally credible. It means developing the discernment to separate reporting from opinion, evidence from assertion, and fact from interpretation. As we move toward our conclusion, I want you to consider a profound insight that ties everything together. Propaganda works by exploiting natural human tendencies, but awareness of these tendencies is the first step toward freedom from manipulation. The most dangerous prison is the one you don't know you're in, but once you see the bars, you've already begun your escape. In the final section, we'll explore practical strategies for breaking free from propaganda's influence and reclaiming your mental autonomy in a world designed to compromise it. The path forward isn't easy, but as Orwell himself wrote, "In a time of deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act." We've explored how propaganda functions as a form of modern slavery, trapping minds in carefully constructed realities. Now let's focus on the most important insight of all. Seeing propaganda clearly is the first step toward neutralizing its power. The fundamental truth is this: Propaganda requires your participation to succeed. Unlike physical coercion, mental manipulation needs your mind to accept and internalize the messages being presented. This means you have far more power than you might realize. By developing awareness of how propaganda operates, you begin to break its hold, like a magic trick that loses its effect once you understand how it's performed. Research from cognitive science supports this idea. A 2019 study in the journal Cognition found that simply prompting people to consider how headlines might be misleading improved their ability to identify false information. Another study from Cambridge University demonstrated that people who understand common manipulation techniques, like appealing to emotion over reason or presenting false equivalencies, become significantly more resistant to propaganda's influence. So what practical steps can you take to reclaim your mental freedom? First, develop the habit of conscious consumption. Before accepting any claim, ask yourself, who benefits if I believe this? What evidence supports it? What relevant information might be missing? What emotions does this trigger in me? And how might those emotions be influencing my judgment? These simple questions create mental space between you and the message, space that allows for critical evaluation. Second, practice horizontal reading. Instead of diving deep into a single source, check multiple sources on the same topic. Research from the Stanford History Education Group shows this approach is how professional fact-checkers operate. They don't judge a source in isolation. They compare coverage across different outlets to identify consistencies and contradictions. This doesn't mean treating all sources as equally credible, but rather using comparison to reveal what might be missing from any single account. Third, build information literacy skills. Learn to distinguish between different types of content: reporting, opinion, analysis, and advocacy. Understand the economic models behind different information sources, whether they make money through subscriptions, advertising, donations, or serving specific interests. The Columbia Journalism Review notes that people who understand media business models are better equipped to identify potential biases and conflicts of interest. Fourth, cultivate intellectual humility. Propaganda thrives when we're certain we're right and others are wrong. Research in political psychology shows that people who recognize the limitations of their knowledge and remain open to revising their views are significantly less vulnerable to manipulation. This doesn't mean abandoning your values or treating all claims as equally valid. It means maintaining awareness that your understanding is always incomplete. Fifth, create intentional distance from information technologies designed to manipulate. Studies from the Center for Humane Technology demonstrate that reducing social media usage leads to decreased anxiety, improved concentration, and better information discernment. Consider regular digital detoxes, disabling notifications, and setting boundaries around when and how you consume news. The philosopher Epictetus said, "Make it your study to distinguish what is base from what is noble, so that your mind becomes a good winemaker rather than a taster of wine made by someone else." This ancient wisdom captures the essence of propaganda resistance, developing the capacity to process information independently rather than accepting whatever is served to you. Remember that this journey isn't just about personal liberation. When enough individuals learn to resist propaganda, collective change becomes possible. Research on wisdom of crowds phenomena shows that groups where members think independently make better decisions than those where conformity prevails. By reclaiming your mental autonomy, you contribute to a healthier information ecosystem for everyone. Orwell understood this when he created the character of Winston Smith, an ordinary person whose primary act of rebellion was attempting to maintain independent thought. As Orwell wrote, "Being in a minority, even a minority of one, did not make you mad. There was truth and there was untruth, and if you clung to the truth even against the whole world, you were not mad." So what will you choose? Will you continue to consume information passively, allowing others to shape your perception of reality? Or will you embrace the challenge of thinking critically, even when it requires effort and discomfort? Will you remain in the comfortable prison of familiar narratives, or step into the sometimes unsettling freedom of intellectual independence? The tools of liberation are available to you right now. Every time you pause before sharing a provocative headline, every time you seek out diverse perspectives on an issue, every time you ask, "How do I know this is true?" you're breaking the chains of propaganda and reclaiming your autonomy. This journey isn't easy. Propaganda systems are designed by experts who understand human psychology and exploit our natural tendencies. But remember that these systems, however sophisticated, ultimately depend on your participation, your attention, your belief, your emotional reaction, your willingness to spread their messages. Without these, propaganda loses its power. As we conclude, I want to leave you with this thought. In a world where control increasingly operates through information rather than force, protecting your mind is the ultimate act of freedom. The most powerful prison is one built of beliefs. But beliefs can be examined, questioned, and changed. George Orwell's warnings about propaganda weren't just about dystopian futures. They were about the constant vigilance required to maintain genuine freedom. By developing awareness of how propaganda operates and practicing intentional information consumption, you aren't just protecting yourself. You're preserving the possibility of a society where people can think freely, communicate honestly, and work together based on shared reality. The choice to break free from propaganda's influence isn't just personal, it's profound. It's about reclaiming your fundamental humanity in a world that too often treats minds as things to be manipulated rather than conscious beings deserving of truth. This liberation begins with a simple but revolutionary act: the decision to think for yourself,